you sure there wasn't anything over the hill, Dad?
Nothing. It was just a bad dream.
I bet it was ball lightning.
No, Dad, I know what ball lightning is. It wasn't that. It was something else. Dad. Where's Dad?
I don't know. It's probably around here somewhere.
No, I looked all over.
Your little lad's got quite an imagination.
Yes, I know.
Thank you for coming, Chief. Looks like we found him ourselves.
Everything's fine now.
Dad's weirded out.
Don't worry.
David Gardner!
A UFO lands in the back of your house and puts something in your mom and dad's neck, and then it gets your teacher and the police and your friend Heather.
He's not well.
He may be in danger. Well, Sue, what the hell kind of nurse are you anyway?
A lot of aliens running around loose underneath the town.
It's
A little hard to swallow.
NASA does confirm a visual sighting.
I saw them. They're bigger than anything I've ever seen in my life.
David Gardner!
They tried to catch me.
I'll get you.
They chased me through their tunnels. They almost killed me.
The detonator is set.
The late Tobe Hooper's remake of the 1953 classic Invaders from Mars arrived in US theatres in early June of 1986 and made its way to the UK in August that year. Budgeted at $12 million, which was still quite pricey for what producers Cannon Films would often spend on their productions. It would only crawl back $5 million in the USA. It's unclear how much it managed to earn worldwide, but it was seen as another financial failure for the studio. The critical response it received clearly didn't help its box office performance, with most reviews leaning on the negative. The New York Times said that Hooper knows how to construct a horror film, so it builds to a screaming pitch, but when the Martians are finally revealed, the film becomes less terrifying. We get lost in the complexities of the inventions, and finally they seem overdone and overproduced. The Los Angeles Times stated, "If you can tap into Hooper's oddball rhythms and cold send-ups, you can enjoy yourself, and though the 1953 Invaders was an effective movie, it's not really the classic that people remember. Except the Menzies' superb production designs, everything in the remake is better. The acting, the camera work, definitely the Martians. It may not grip audiences in the same way, but that's because Hooper is trying something harder, a conscious campiness that's tough to bring off." Cinefantastique magazine rated it as mediocre, saying the Martians look more silly than scary. They are too cartoon-like, even comical, to be the least bit frightening. The new Invaders from Mars is perhaps intended as a tribute to the original, but it is a too respectful tribute. It is a homage that seems ultimately bloodless, lifeless, because it lacks any life of its own. Variety panned the film as an embarrassing combination of kitsch and boredom, adding that a remake of the 1953 original was a reasonable idea. Dan O'Bannon and Don Jacoby's inferior screenplay fails to bring in new ideas or provide interesting dialogue. Years later, in the documentary Electric Boogaloo: The History of Cannon Films, Albert Pyun revealed that Golan and Globus were disappointed by the film, as Tobe had sold them on his vision and he didn't deliver. As with most Cannon pictures, they arrived and went from theatres after a week or two, and Invaders from Mars would disappear for a number of years, but managed to get more exposure on home video and later on cable TV, where it found a larger audience. It would get released on Laserdisc from Elite Entertainment in April of 1996, and eventually DVD. It would thankfully get the proper treatment from Shout Factory in 2015. Over the years, the film started to build a bigger audience, and is now considered a cult classic thanks to its campiness and extensive use of practical effects have helped it age well. After Poltergeist, Tobe Hooper didn't receive much support for his contributions to the film, as the infamous making-of broadcast during the film's marketing featured little footage of Tobe and only focused on Steven Spielberg, who was the movie's producer. But it was clear to many who watched this featurette that Steven had directed the film, despite Hooper receiving the credit. The debate still wages on to this day on who did what. But at the time, Tobe couldn't shake off this rumour and needed to prove himself, and thankfully he received one of the best deals a director could get from Cannon Films. They wanted him to make 3 pictures, giving him the freedom to make what he wanted, but part of the deal was to produce a sequel to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which had made him famous in the industry when it was released in 1974. The first picture with Cannon was Life Force, which was the studio's first foray into big-budget productions. The studio only invested in a couple of $1 million per picture that could turn a healthy profit. The idea of spending more than $10 million or even $20 million for the likes of Life Force would seem a major risk, but Cannon wanted to compete with the big studios such as Warner Brothers and Paramount, after some big box office hits and a huge injection of investment money, giving them the chance to match the big boys in the industry. But some felt it was their way to buy some legitimacy and not be seen as filmmakers who produce schlock. Life Force, despite being this big lavish production and thoroughly entertaining, didn't perform well at the box office and was heavily edited for its US release, further doing damage to its box office takings. But instead of licking their wounds, they were already planning Tobe's next film, Invaders from Mars, which was a film he wanted to remake for nearly 10 years. The imagery of the 1953 classic had burned into his mind, and he felt it was time to update it for contemporary audiences. Many Cannon films had a short pre-production turnaround, with this rush to get filming quickly and get the film out in cinemas to recoup their losses. As Tobe was finishing up Life Force, he was already travelling back and forth from the UK to the USA to plan Invaders. A number of the talent from Life Force jumped onto Invaders from Mars, with Dan O'Bannon and Don Jacoby writing the original script that would later get rewritten by David Womark and David Lippman, and with John Dykstra returning to supply the visual effects. Concept artist William Stout was brought on to design the Martians, the spacecraft, its interior, the neck needles, and even the film's logo. The world of the Martians had to have this biomechanical look. William had worked on Conan the Barbarian and First Blood as an artist, and made the leap to production designer on The Return of the Living Dead, and later Masters of the Universe. William was getting a lot of offers during the 80s, and he was interested in Invaders from Mars. As he loved Menzies' work on the 50s classic, he had a lot of respect for Tobe Hooper's work on Texas Chainsaw, and was good friends with writer Dan O'Bannon, so it was an easy decision for him. William Stout always had issues with movie monsters, who basically looked like guys in a costume, very much like the 1950s film, so he wanted to create something different. As he was friends with Rick Baker, Rick said he always wanted to create a monster that had a guy in a suit but would be facing backwards, so the leg arrangement wouldn't make any sense. So the idea was incorporated into the designs of the drones. The Supreme Leader was inspired by the old Mars Attacks trading cards. To help create the sets based on Stout's designs, Les Dilley was hired as the production designer, making Invaders from Mars his first American production. Les started out his film career as an art director on Richard Lester's Musketeer films, then worked on Star Wars, Superman, Alien, Raiders of the Lost Ark and Ridley Scott's Legend. Tobe told Les to make the alien ship look organic, and you can see some influence of H.R. Giger, especially with the doors in the chamber. For the main cast, we have Hunter Carson as David Gardner, who first spots the alien invasion and goes on a journey to stop them. Hunter previously starred in the Academy Award-winning film Paris, Texas, which garnered him some attention. Hunter knew Tobe as Tobe was close friends with his dad, Kit Carlson, who would go on to write Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. As Tobe knew Hunter so well, he thought he would be perfect for the role of David. The late Karen Black plays Linda, the school nurse. Karen is the actual mother of Hunter. Karen was a massive star during the 70s, appearing in Easy Rider, Easy Pieces, The Great Gatsby, Nashville, and Capricorn 1. The late Louise Fletcher plays Mrs. McKelch, who is the evil teacher at the school who has it out for David. Louise was a well-respected actor, best known for her performance in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which earned her an Academy Award and a BAFTA. The hardest part for Louise was eating the frog, Toby had admitted in a 2015 interview. They produced a giant gummy frog she had to eat and swallow. She took a lot of convincing and hated the taste of it. Despite that, she really enjoyed playing a villain. Timothy Bottoms plays David's father George, who becomes under the influence of the aliens very early on, as he works for the military. Timothy is a familiar face of TV and film, but is probably best known for spoofing George W. Bush, as he strikes a strong resemblance to him and can mimic his voice, and would appear in a number of comedy shows impersonating the former president. Lorraine Newman plays Ellie, David's mother. Lorraine was a comedian and impressionist, appearing on Saturday Night Live in the late 70s on the Coneheads sketch with Dan Aykroyd, and would later play Suzanne Rock in the live-action Flintstones movie. The late great James Caron plays General Clement Wilson. James was a highly respected character actor of the big and small screen for decades. He had just appeared in Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist, and recently The Return of the Living Dead, delivering one of my favourite performances from him.
Are we going crazy? No, it's that crap on the tanks. They got them chemicals. It's all over everything. Stupid asshole. Watch your tongue, boy, if you like this job. Like this job?
Bud Cort plays a young NASA scientist who joins David and the military as they enter the Martian spacecraft. Bud provided the voice of the computer in Electric Dreams the year before, and popped up in Heat, Dogma, Coyote Ugly, and voiced Toyman in the Superman animated series. And finally we have Jimmy Hunt, who played David in the original 1953 film, getting a cameo as the police chief. Filming started in July of 1985 and ended in late November. They shot in and around California. David's school, which is called the Menzies Elementary as a nod to the director of the 50s film, was the Eagle Rock School in LA. For the military base, they made use of the Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro. For interior sequences and even some locations set outdoors during the night, such as the picket fence and the garden of David's home, were shot at the Hollywood Center stages. Inside the Martian spacecraft, they used a famous hangar in Long Beach that was used to build Howard Hughes' Spruce Goose. They had to make use of this hangar as there was no soundstage big enough to accommodate this set, and it would be the first time a film production company had used it for that purpose. The gardener's home in the film is the same house that was purpose-built for the 1948 Cary Grant film. Mr. Blandings builds his dream house, and still stands as the offices for the park employees at the Malibu Creek State Park. During the shoot where the Martians are being shot in the chamber, the set accidentally caught fire, due to the foam they used to construct the set was highly flammable and hadn't been banned yet. The puppeteers of the drones were unaware of what was going on, and were informed by one of the crew at the last minute to get out before it was too late. Tobe Hooper loved to edit while he was shooting, so we had a version to watch once he'd finished filming. Menachem Golan recommended his editor, who had done Delta Force, who was very fast at working, so once filming had wrapped he had a version of the film in a good state to work from. The film did have a number of sequences removed, one that featured in the trailer and even the behind the scenes video. It shows David finding his dad returning from over the hill with his slipper missing. As the film hadn't been scored at that point, it appears the early cut of the film was temped with Jerry Goldsmith's score to Outland. For the film's story, David awakens to a thunderstorm and witnesses a strange alien spacecraft landing on Copper Hill, just behind his house. David panics and gets his parents, who don't believe him, but his father agrees to investigate. The following morning his dad is behaving strangely, and with an unexpected mark on the back of his neck. David returns home from school and his father can't be found. He and his mother call the police and they investigate over the hill behind his house. His father randomly appears out of the bushes and assures the police everything is fine. Later that evening, his father takes his mother over the hill, and David knows his mother will be changed forever. At school, David discovers his teacher eating a frog, and his classmate Heather is not acting like her usual self. David shares his fears with the school nurse, after seeing she has no neck mark. Linda is skeptical but begins to share David's concerns after seeing the mark on Mrs. McCouch. David, now feeling alone, has to find out what's going on, and later follows his teacher to a cave in Copper Hill and discovers that the alien ship is real, seeing large monsters with a large brain leading them. He realises they are controlling many people around the town via brain implants inserted through their neck. David flees and reveals what he has learned to Linda. David, knowing they can't do anything by themselves, they seek help from General Wilson, commander of the military base that employs David's father. The general finds their story a bit far-fetched, but his assistant informs him there were reports of a UFO, and begins to believe them when two alien abductees at the site are exposed and confronted, and die from the kill switches in their implants. Wilson meets with NASA and SETI scientists, who insist on proceeding with a scheduled launch to Mars, but the rocket is destroyed by a bomb planted by David's father George. The scientists conclude that the Martians interpreted the launch as an act of war, and have already begun invading Earth. For the visual effects, Tobe Hooper would make use of FX supervisor John Dykstra and his team at Apogee for the optical effects and miniatures. For example, the landing of the alien craft and its eventual destruction, the explosion of the NASA rocket, animation for the bolts of lightning and the Martian laser cannons. To bring William Stout's designs to life, Tobe met with Rick Baker and Rob Bottin, but they were both busy with other projects, but they recommended Stan Winston, who worked on The Thing with Bottin and recently worked on The Terminator. He was tasked with making Stout's designs work practically and to give them character. One of the obstacles in making the drones work was their size. These things were big, said Alec Gillis, and to make them in foam latex would have required a bigger oven than anybody had. So instead they had to come up with ways of injecting polyform into big fiberglass moulds. Stan Winston's intention was to hide the man in a suit approached by positioning two performers inside the drone. A little person would face forward and manipulate the face with their legs and arms, and a large stunt performer would walk backwards, creating a non-human leg joint as Stout had suggested. For the Supreme Leader in the original 50s film, it was a human head with his little tentacles. What Stout conceived was a giant brain on legs. Stan Winston's crew built a puppet featuring a lizard-like tail and an animatronic face. They built layers of bladders inside the puppet to simulate a breathing motion. In the middle of shooting, James Cameron hired Stan Winston to do Aliens. As they had already discussed a lot of ideas before production started on the film, Tobe was happy to let him go, and Stan went off to Pinewood Studios and left Alec Gillis in charge of the team and to manage the work, which he had never done before, which was daunting, but it was the experience he needed. The biggest strength of Invaders from Mars is the visual and practical effects. It's their designs that you remember. I love the Supreme Being. It just reminded me of Krang from Ninja Turtles, and it does look quite cute when it's being shot and panicking. Oh, poor thing. The big drones are great to look at, but due to their design they are slow and cumbersome, thus making for a weak enemy for the soldiers who can cut them down in minutes with their guns. With John Dykstra in charge of the effects, you know you're going to get some clean opticals that are shot on large format film and look great. The most impressive effect is the NASA rocket being destroyed. It's an incredible miniature, it looks real. It's just a shame the destruction of the alien spacecraft doesn't make much of an impact in its execution. For a film that is nearly 40 years old, the effects have stood up well over the years and are certainly the highlight of the film. The film's score was composed by Christopher Young with additional material by David Storrs. Tobe Hooper originally wanted James Horner, but he was unavailable. Michael Kamen was also considered, having produced additional music to Life Force for its re-edit for the US theatrical release, but Cannon felt he was too expensive. Christopher Young was suggested by the film's publicist, and after a meeting he was hired. Young noticed the first signs of problems when he took the job. At the time, Hooper was already in deep pre-production on Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, and had very little time to talk to Young. In fact, they could only get together for one single meeting to spot the film, and this was only for the first 6 reels. Christopher Young was only given 23 days from start to finish in which to write, orchestrate and record the score. In his contract, he had to provide 15 minutes of orchestral music and 45 minutes worth of electronic. The first part of the score was recorded at the CBS Radford Recording Studio in Hollywood. The cues recorded at the time included the main and end titles, some tender moments, and the action cues for the film's climax. The players in the orchestra had a hard time playing some of the cues due to the complexity of the writing. However, they did get everything done on time, and as Tobe Hooper wished, with a similar sound to Jerry Goldsmith's work. Christopher Young mixed electronic music with weird sounds such as waterfalls and crowd noises, but Cannon Films changed their minds on the direction of the music and didn't like Young's electronic score. Christopher said in an interview in 2015 that they wanted music to sound like Mars, not to sound like it was from Mars. So they brought on David Storrs, who had worked at Cannon scoring various parts of their trailers to give the film studio what they wanted. During the dubbing stages, neither Hooper nor Young were available to attend those sessions, and when the dubbing was finished, only about a third of Young's orchestral score remained, and almost none of his electronic score. Despite a lot of Young's material not making it into the film's edit, he said later he was happy with what he produced, and said in many ways it was some of the best music I've done to date. The soundtrack got released in 1986 on LP, featuring 11 tracks totaling 31 minutes of music, and it included none of Christopher's material, only David Storrs' compositions. Young's work did eventually get released in July of 2009 from Intrada, with a 2-CD set, featuring Young's and Storrs' work, with over 2 hours worth of music, limited to 1,200 copies. This soundtrack is now a collector's item. Christopher's themes for the family and tender moments capture those traditional scores by John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith, feeling like it's been taken straight out of a Steven Spielberg or Joe Dante movie. The military march works well to complement the action sequences. His original synthesizer themes are certainly creative and interesting, providing an atmospheric sound, but feels more suited to a darker movie, and overall sound a bit repetitive to listen to. David Storr's music lacks the grandness of Young's orchestral work, which is a given, but his synth work, though perhaps not as creative as Young's, is less weird and does a better job of fitting with the tone of the film, so both composers provided what the film needed as a musical voice. The soundtrack is certainly worth a listen, but finding a copy of the limited soundtrack release at a good price may be tough, as it's been out of print for years. I never saw the original 1953 classic and the 1986 remake as a kid or into my teenage years. I of course knew of the 50s film, but the Tobe Hooper version was completely off my radar for years. Never saw it on VHS or ever saw it broadcast on TV. It seemed forgotten about, and I only came across the film when I started producing reviews for YouTube and researching Tobe's filmography. When I eventually got round to seeing it, I was pretty underwhelmed by it, to be honest. Firstly, I was expecting something over the top, crazy, and attempting to do something new with this remake, like we saw with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing, The Blob and The Fly. But Tobe's vision for Invaders from Mars was a straight up love letter to the original and made no attempts to refresh its themes or bring something new to the table. But instead it gets lost in the visual style of the film, and a sense of paranoia and horror elements get lost in the mix. As soon as the film starts, we have these opening titles clearly inspired by the Superman films. In the audio commentary, Tobe Hooper laughs about the obvious comparisons, and once we find ourselves at David's house, we are treated to a great visual style that makes great efforts to capture that old 3-strip Technicolor look, especially when the police arrive to find David's father. The set and lighting perfectly captures that 1950s style of filmmaking. Even with the interiors at the school, we are seeing production design and photography feeling very retro in its execution. I can imagine critics just getting a sense they are watching a retro movie. Clearly it's all done on purpose, but to many general moviegoers it may have appeared dated. Many filmmakers during the 80s and into the 90s had this love for 1950s cinema and pop culture, with Joe Dante, Steven Spielberg, Robert Zemeckis, and of course Tobe. So I can understand he wanted to remake this movie he loved during his childhood, but I think his passion for it, especially its visual approach, is what drove him to make this, and perhaps not his underlining themes. The 1950s, as it's common to many of those who have a keen interest in history, was a time of paranoia with the threat of communism invading the USA, and when it came to cinema, taking those political threats and weaving them into a science fiction story, as it was a popular genre during that decade, thanks to advances in technology and the further development of the atomic bomb, it just expanded everyone's imagination to create compelling stories in print and on film. And Invaders from Mars, like with the invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, took the threat of communism and repackaged it as an alien invasion. Whereas Body Snatchers was through the eyes of an adult, Invaders took the approach of seeing this threat through the eyes of a child. Having a child experience this puts you into that area where you're making a film to entertain that age group. Of course adults can enjoy it, but Invaders from Mars is designed to entertain a younger audience, and Tobe does do that well with his new take on it. He doesn't struggle with the tone and campiness, which is tough to pull off, and he shows he can do something different, avoiding being only remembered as this horror director. But in efforts to do something new, I think they should have perhaps gone with a teenager for this update instead of a younger child, which would have given them a wider canvas to explore the horror and paranoid nature of the story, to really amp up the tension and to make the Martians more threatening. Why the Martians have chosen to invade Earth is not made entirely clear with the narrative. We get some exposition dumps by the scientists later on, as David quizzes them about the findings on Mars, about what is true and what isn't, about the conspiracy theories surrounding the many photos from the dusty cold planet. The whole NASA mission to launch a rocket to Mars seems like a throwaway plotline, compared to the 1950s version, where we got a more detailed discussion in the second act, and not have it left to the third act with a quick scene which has led the Martians to invade, seeing us as a threat. Once the aliens have taken control of their victims, we are seeing them act very much like in Body Snatchers, just no emotion and doing everything slowly and calculated for the most part. Compared to the original, they appear more aggressive. His dad, who seems very distant in the remake, is aggressive in the 50s version, even giving his son a good slapping. Gee whiz! Only David's teacher seems to carry over that aggressive attitude, and strangely seems out of place compared to everyone else who has been taken over. Once the action finally kicks in as the troops get on board the Martian spacecraft, it's a clunky affair. The pace certainly isn't glacial like the 50s version, which is dragged out, as William Cameron Menzies makes use of too much stock footage. In the 1980s version, you get a sense they were pushed for time, and perhaps they didn't get many takes and not enough setups. It just becomes this plodding affair that doesn't really excite you with its pace and what takes place. What doesn't help the movie is the sound mix, which seems flat and lacks any real punch to it. With Toby's previous efforts on Life Force, it has this wham-bam explosive approach to it, but Invaders from Mars seems very muted, and when David runs out of the craft with his parents chasing him, it's a slow sequence that lacks any sense of urgency, which is the opposite of what is supposed to be happening. The craft is going to explode as it's taking off, and when they eventually escape and it's destroyed, there's not much impact with the sound, having this big ending feel very deflated. Invaders from Mars is a visually interesting movie and is perfectly watchable. I would never say it's a bad film, but it's a very average one, and you get this strong impression watching it that Tobe Hooper and the writers especially wasted this opportunity. They could have done so much more with this premise to have something unique to say, to deliver a new message of this threat of invasion. Body Snatchers in 1978 did such a wonderful job at taking the old themes from the 50s film and modernising it, pleasing the older fans and new audiences alike. In the case of Invaders from Mars, it may have pleased those who grew up with the classic with its visual homages to the original, but like many of the critics who pointed out at the time, they wanted more, and the film didn't have anything there to offer, which is a real shame. I think the short pre-production didn't help the film. The script clearly needed more work, and if time was given, they could have revised it and thought of new ways to spice up the story to really update it, and to make it scary with a greater sense of paranoia. So David didn't know who to trust at every turn, having the sense he was slowly being outnumbered, and also pushed the alien threat and their goals, leaving the audience wondering what they would do to you in their efforts to take over the world. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and click the bell to be notified of my latest retrospectives and reviews. Big thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to get involved and gain early access to my content and exclusive videos, then follow the link below.